The moment my sister stood up at my 31st birthday dinner and raised her champagne flute to announce that I was officially the family failure, I knew this would be a birthday I would never forget. What she did not know, what none of them gathered around that perfectly set table could have imagined, was that in exactly 17 minutes my phone would ring with news that would transform their cruel laughter into stunned silence. Sometimes the people who underestimate you the most are about to witness your greatest triumph. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Isabella Rodriguez, and for 31 years, I had been the disappointment that my family could never quite figure out how to fix. In a household where success was measured by salary figures, prestigious job titles, and social status, I was the aberration that disrupted their carefully constructed narrative of achievement and respectability. The Rodriguez family had built their reputation on concrete accomplishments that could be quantified and compared. My father, Eduardo Rodriguez, was the senior partner at Rodriguez & Associates, the most successful accounting firm in Denver, Colorado. His office walls were lined with certificates, awards, and photographs of him shaking hands with mayors, governors, and business leaders whose tax returns had made him wealthy and influential. My mother, Carmen Rodriguez, held the position of Chief Financial Officer at Mountain Vista Medical Center, where she commanded a team of 47 financial professionals and managed an annual budget that exceeded $200 million. She wore her authority like expensive jewelry, subtle but unmistakably present, and she had never encountered a problem that could not be solved through proper planning, strategic thinking, and disciplined execution. My older brother, Miguel, had followed the predetermined path with mathematical precision. Harvard Business School, followed by a position at McKinsey & Company, then a rapid ascent to Vice President of Strategic Development at a Fortune 500 technology company. At 34, he owned a house in an exclusive neighborhood, drove a car that cost more than most people earned in a year, and had recently become engaged to a woman whose father owned 3 successful restaurants and whose mother served on the boards of multiple charitable organizations. My younger sister, Sophia, had chosen a different but equally respectable route through life. She had graduated summa cum laude from Northwestern University with a degree in journalism, then secured a position as an investigative reporter at the Denver Tribune, where her exposés on municipal corruption and corporate malfeasance had earned her recognition from the Colorado Press Association and a reputation as one of the rising stars in regional journalism. At 28, she was already being courted by national news organizations and had recently signed a contract to write a book about political accountability that would be published by a respected academic press. And then there was me, the one who had abandoned a promising career in corporate communications to pursue what my family consistently referred to as, quote, that writing hobby. The one who chose to live in a converted garage apartment behind a Victorian house in the Arts District, rather than in the suburban developments where successful people were supposed to reside. The one who spent her days crafting stories that existed only in her imagination, while the rest of the family built tangible achievements that could be measured, evaluated, and respected by others. For the past 6 years, I had been working on what my family considered an exercise in self-indulgence and financial irresponsibility. While they accumulated professional credentials, property investments, and retirement savings, I was creating a novel that consumed my thoughts, my time, and my limited financial resources, with no guarantee that anyone would ever read it, much less pay money to purchase it. The Rodriguez family gatherings had become increasingly uncomfortable exercises in diplomatic avoidance. Birthday dinners, holiday celebrations, and family reunions featured extensive discussions of Miguel's latest business triumphs, Sophia's journalistic achievements, and my parents' professional recognitions, while my presence was acknowledged with polite inquiries about my project that carried the underlying assumption that eventually I would abandon this impractical pursuit and return to the sensible world of steady employment and predictable income. But this birthday dinner was different. This time, the polite tolerance had transformed into something more direct and more cruel. The dinner was held at Montrose Manor, an upscale restaurant in downtown Denver that my family favored for important celebrations. The private dining room featured floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline, crystal chandeliers that cast warm light across mahogany tables, and an atmosphere of refined elegance that reinforced the Rodriguez family's position as people of substance and achievement. The guest list included my immediate family, plus my brother's fiancée Rachel and her parents, who had been invited to strengthen the social bonds between our families. Also present were my father's business partner David Chen and his wife Susan, who had been family friends for more than 15 years and whose presence added weight to whatever pronouncements would be made during the evening. The conversation during the first hour focused on the expected topics. Miguel's recent promotion had come with a significant salary increase and additional stock options that would accelerate his path toward financial independence. Sophia's investigative series on water rights disputes had been nominated for a state journalism award and had attracted the attention of editors at the Washington Post. My parents' firm had just secured a contract to handle the financial reorganization of a major municipal transportation authority, a project that would enhance their reputation and generate substantial revenue for the next 3 years. I listened to these updates with genuine happiness for their successes, contributing appropriate congratulations and asking interested questions about their projects and achievements. But I could feel the underlying tension building as the evening progressed, the unspoken awareness that eventually the conversation would turn to me and my continued commitment to what they viewed as an unsuccessful and increasingly embarrassing personal project. The moment arrived as we finished the main course and the waiter began clearing plates in preparation for dessert. My father, who had consumed enough wine to loosen his usual diplomatic restraints, decided that this birthday celebration provided an appropriate opportunity to address what he clearly considered a family problem that had persisted too long without resolution. "Isabella," he began, his voice carrying the authoritative tone that he used in business meetings when he needed to deliver difficult news to clients who had made poor financial decisions. "Your mother and I have been discussing your situation, and we think it might be time for you to consider some practical alternatives to your current approach." The table became quiet in the way that precedes either very good news or very bad news. I could sense the other guests preparing themselves to witness a conversation that would be uncomfortable for everyone present, but which my father apparently considered necessary for the family's overall well-being. "What kind of alternatives?" I asked, though I suspected that I already knew the direction this conversation would take. My mother leaned forward slightly, her expression combining maternal concern with professional exasperation. "Sweetheart, you have been working on this book for 6 years. 6 years. In that same time period, Miguel has been promoted 3 times. Sophia has built a significant reputation in journalism. And you have produced a manuscript that no publisher has agreed to publish." "Actually," I said carefully, "I have not submitted the manuscript to any publishers yet. I have been working with an editor to ensure that it meets professional standards before I begin the submission process." Sophia, who had remained silent until this point, chose this moment to contribute what she clearly considered helpful perspective. "Isabella, I work in the publishing industry. I understand how these things work. The statistics are not encouraging. Less than 1% of submitted manuscripts are accepted for publication by traditional publishers, and even when books are published, most authors earn less than minimum wage when you calculate their hourly compensation over the time invested in writing." Rachel, my brother's fiancée, nodded sympathetically. As someone who worked in human resources for a large corporation, she was accustomed to evaluating career decisions based on practical outcomes and measurable results. "Have you considered returning to corporate communications? Your previous experience with Henderson Marketing would probably qualify you for a senior position somewhere, and the salary would provide much better financial security than writing." David Chen, my father's business partner, offered what he apparently considered constructive advice based on his experience counseling clients about financial planning and retirement preparation. "Isabella, I do not want to discourage your creative interests, but at 31, you need to start thinking seriously about building assets and establishing a foundation for your future. Writing can be a wonderful hobby, but hobbies do not pay for retirement or provide the resources necessary for major life purchases like homes and children." I felt the familiar combination of frustration and sadness that accompanied these family discussions. They were not deliberately cruel people, and their concerns were rooted in genuine affection and worry about my financial security and long-term happiness. But their inability to understand or respect my commitment to writing felt like a rejection of everything that mattered most to me. "I appreciate your concern," I said, trying to maintain the diplomatic tone that family gatherings required. But I believe in this project, and I am committed to seeing it through to completion and publication. My brother Miguel, who had been listening to this exchange with the analytical expression that he used when evaluating business proposals, decided to contribute his perspective as someone who understood markets, competition, and realistic outcome assessment. "Isabella," he said, his voice carrying the patient tone that successful executives use when explaining obvious concepts to people who lack business experience. "I have reviewed the market research on publishing. The industry is contracting, bookstore sales are declining, and even established authors are struggling to maintain their income levels. Starting a career in writing at 31 with no previous publications and no industry connections is essentially equivalent to deciding to become a professional athlete at an age when most athletes are already retiring." The comparison stung because it contained enough truth to be difficult to refute. I was starting later than most successful authors, I lacked industry connections, and I had no previous publications to demonstrate my capabilities to potential publishers or readers. But before I could formulate a response, Sophia delivered what she clearly considered the definitive statement that would end this discussion and force me to confront reality. She stood up, raised her champagne flute with theatrical flourish, and announced to the entire table, "I would like to propose a toast to my sister Isabella, who has officially earned the title of the family failure by spending 6 years avoiding real work, while the rest of us have built actual careers and made meaningful contributions to society." The words hit me like a physical blow. The room erupted in the kind of nervous laughter that occurs when someone says something cruel enough to be shocking, but socially connected enough to the speaker to make direct confrontation awkward. Miguel smiled uncomfortably and raised his glass halfway, uncertain whether this was meant to be humor or genuine cruelty. Rachel looked horrified but remained silent, recognizing that interfering in family dynamics would be inappropriate for someone who was not yet officially part of the Rodriguez family. My parents exchanged a glance that suggested they disapproved of Sophia's delivery but not necessarily her message. David and Susan Chen focused on their dessert plates, clearly wishing they had not been present for this particular family moment. But I did not cry, and I did not leave the table, and I did not respond with the anger or hurt that everyone expected. Instead, I remained seated, looked directly at Sophia, and said quietly, "Thank you for that perspective. I hope you will remember this moment." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What none of them knew, what I had not yet shared with anyone in my family, was that 3 weeks earlier, I had finally completed the submission process that I had been preparing for during the previous 6 months. After working with a professional editor to refine the manuscript, after researching publishers who specialized in literary fiction, after crafting query letters and synopsis documents, and preparing submission materials according to the specific requirements of each publishing house, I had sent my novel to 12 carefully selected publishers. The book was titled The Weight of Silence, and it explored the experiences of 3 generations of women in an immigrant family navigating the complex dynamics of cultural preservation, personal ambition, and family loyalty in contemporary America. The story drew from my own experiences as a second-generation Mexican-American woman, but it transcended personal narrative to examine universal themes of identity, belonging, and the courage required to pursue individual dreams within the context of family expectations and cultural obligations. I had poured 6 years of my life into this project, not because I was avoiding real work or indulging in unrealistic fantasies, but because I had something important to say and believed that literature could provide a platform for voices and perspectives that were often overlooked in mainstream cultural conversations. The research and writing process had required me to develop expertise in areas that my family never bothered to investigate or understand. I had studied contemporary literary markets, analyzed successful debuts by authors with similar backgrounds and themes, and worked with professionals who specialized in manuscript development and publishing industry navigation. I had treated my writing career with the same seriousness and strategic thinking that my family applied to their business and professional pursuits, but because the work was creative rather than corporate, they dismissed it as lacking substance or practical value. As Sophia finished her cruel toast and the uncomfortable laughter began to subside, my phone vibrated with an incoming call. I glanced at the screen and recognized the number immediately. It was Margaret Thornton, senior editor at Beacon Press, one of the most prestigious publishers on my submission list. I had not expected to hear from any publishers for at least 6 to 8 weeks, as the submission guidelines clearly stated that response times typically ranged from 2 to 3 months. The fact that Margaret Thornton was calling after only 3 weeks could mean either that my manuscript had been rejected so quickly that it warranted immediate dismissal, or that something extraordinary had occurred. "Excuse me," I said to the table. "I need to take this call." Sophia rolled her eyes dramatically. "Really, Isabella? You cannot even sit through your own birthday dinner without checking your phone? What could possibly be so urgent that it cannot wait until after dessert?" I did not answer her. I simply stepped away from the table and moved to the corner of the private dining room where I could speak privately, while remaining visible to the family members who were clearly annoyed by this interruption. "Hello, Ms. Rodriguez." Margaret Thornton's voice was warm and professional. "I hope I am not calling at an inconvenient time, but I wanted to reach you personally rather than waiting for our usual business hours." "Not at all," I replied, my heart racing as I tried to interpret the tone of her voice for clues about the purpose of this call. "Thank you for calling. Ms. Rodriguez, I have been editing manuscripts for 23 years, and I can honestly say that The Weight of Silence is one of the most compelling debut novels I have ever encountered. The depth of character development, the authenticity of the cultural perspectives, and the elegance of your prose style have impressed everyone who has read your submission." I felt my knees weaken slightly, and I gripped the back of a nearby chair to steady myself. This was not a rejection call. "I am calling to inform you that Beacon Press would like to offer you a 3-book publishing contract with a substantial advance and a comprehensive marketing campaign for your debut novel. We believe that The Weight of Silence has the potential to reach a wide audience and make a significant impact in contemporary literary fiction." The dining room seemed to fade away as I processed what Margaret Thornton was telling me. A 3-book contract, a substantial advance, a comprehensive marketing campaign. This was not just acceptance. This was recognition at a level that exceeded my most optimistic expectations. "Additionally," Margaret continued, "we would like to submit The Weight of Silence for consideration for several major literary awards, including the National Book Award for Fiction and the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. Our preliminary reader reports suggest that your novel addresses important themes with a literary sophistication that places it among the most promising debuts of the year." I was aware that my family members were watching me from the dinner table, clearly irritated by what they assumed was a casual phone conversation that was inappropriately interrupting our gathering, but I could not focus on their disapproval, because everything I had worked toward for 6 years was suddenly becoming reality in ways I had never dared to imagine. "Ms. Rodriguez, are you still there?" Margaret asked. "Yes," I managed to say. "I am here. This is extraordinary news. Thank you. ... There is one more thing," Margaret said. "The marketing department would like to schedule a photo shoot for the book cover and author publicity materials next week, and our publicity team wants to begin arranging interviews with major media outlets. We believe that your personal story as a daughter of immigrants who has created literature that bridges cultural experiences will resonate strongly with readers and media alike." Quote, as she provided details about contracts, timelines, and next steps, I became aware that the conversation in the dining room had stopped entirely. My family members were staring at me with expressions that ranged from curiosity to concern, clearly wondering what kind of phone call could be serious enough to interrupt a birthday celebration. I concluded the conversation with Margaret Thornton, confirmed that I would receive the formal contract documents within 48 hours, and agreed to a follow-up meeting the following week to discuss publication strategy and promotional planning. When I ended the call and returned to the table, the silence was absolute. Sophia, who moments earlier had been reveling in her role as the family member brave enough to speak uncomfortable truths, now looked uncertain and slightly anxious. "What was that about?" my mother asked, her voice carrying the careful neutrality that she used when she suspected that information might require her to reassess a situation she thought she understood completely. I remained standing at the head of the table, looking at each family member individually before responding. These were people who had spent the evening explaining why my choices were impractical, why my goals were unrealistic, and why my 6 years of dedicated work represented failure rather than investment in future success. "That was Margaret Thornton, senior editor at Beacon Press," I said calmly. "She called to inform me that they are offering me a 3-book publishing contract for my novel, with a substantial advance and a comprehensive marketing campaign. They also plan to submit my book for consideration for the National Book Award and the Pulitzer Prize." The silence that followed was different from any silence that had occurred previously during the evening. This was not the pause that precedes polite congratulations, or the uncomfortable quiet that follows inappropriate comments. This was the absolute stillness that occurs when people realize that their fundamental assumptions about reality have been completely incorrect. Miguel was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are you serious?" "Completely serious," I replied. "The contract documents will arrive within 48 hours. Sophia's face had gone pale, and she was staring at me as if I had suddenly revealed myself to be someone entirely different from the person she thought she knew. "But you said you had not submitted to any publishers yet." "I said that several months ago. I completed the submission process 3 weeks ago, after working with a professional editor, to ensure that the manuscript met industry standards." My father, who had spent the evening explaining why writing was not a viable career choice, now seemed to be struggling to process information that contradicted everything he had assumed about publishing economics and market realities. "What do you mean by substantial advance?" he asked, his accountant's instincts focusing on the financial aspects of this development. I had not planned to discuss the specific financial details, but given the nature of their criticism throughout the evening, I decided that transparency would be appropriate. "The advance is $750,000, paid in installments over the 3-book contract period, plus royalties based on sales performance, and additional compensation for international rights and film adaptation rights." David Chen, who had earlier explained why writing could not provide adequate financial security, was now calculating figures in his head with the expression of someone reassessing an investment opportunity that he had previously dismissed as impractical. Susan Chen was the first family friend to recover enough composure to offer congratulations. "Isabella, this is extraordinary. We had no idea that you were this close to such a significant publishing deal." "Neither did I until 3 weeks ago," I replied honestly. "Publishing contracts are never guaranteed until they are actually offered." Rachel, who had suggested that I return to corporate communications for better financial security, now appeared to be reconsidering her assessment of creative careers and their economic potential. But it was my mother who asked the question that revealed how completely their understanding of my situation had been transformed by this single phone call. "Isabella," she said slowly, "how long did you say you have been working on this book?" 6 years, I replied. "And during those 6 years, we have been treating your work as if it were a hobby, rather than a serious professional undertaking." The statement hung in the air like an acknowledgement of collective misjudgment. For 6 years my family had watched me pursue what they considered an impractical dream, while they focused on building what they believed were more sensible and secure careers. They had offered advice, expressed concern, and ultimately delivered public humiliation based on their assumption that my choices represented failure, rather than investment in long-term success. But now, in the space of a single phone conversation, their assessment of my decisions, my capabilities, and my prospects had been completely overturned. The daughter they had labeled as the family failure had actually been building toward a professional achievement that exceeded anything any of them had accomplished in their respective fields. Sophia, who had stood up 15 minutes earlier to toast my status as the family disappointment, now appeared to be struggling with how to respond to the reality that her cruel characterization had been both inaccurate and publicly embarrassing for her, rather than for me. "Isabella," she said quietly, "I owe you an apology. What I said earlier was inappropriate and hurtful, and it was based on assumptions that were clearly wrong." I appreciated her willingness to acknowledge her mistake, but I was not ready to absolve her of responsibility for the cruelty she had displayed when she believed that I had no defense against her accusations. "Sophia," I replied, "you were not wrong to expect that I should be held accountable for my choices and my results. You were wrong to assume that because you could not see evidence of my progress, no progress was being made. You were wrong to conclude, that because you did not understand the publishing industry timeline, my timeline was unreasonable. And you were wrong to believe that your success in journalism gave you expertise to evaluate my potential success in novel writing. The table remained silent as I continued. But most importantly, you were wrong to think that public humiliation was an appropriate way to express concern about someone you love. The fact that I ultimately proved capable of achieving success does not excuse the cruelty of what you said, and it does not eliminate the damage you were willing to inflict based on incomplete information and poor judgment. Miguel, who had been quiet since learning about the publishing contract, now spoke with the careful tone of someone who recognized that family dynamics had shifted in ways that required diplomatic recalibration. Isabella, I think I speak for all of us when I say that we are proud of your accomplishment and sorry that we did not better understand or support your work during the development process. I looked around the table at faces that reflected confusion, embarrassment, and the dawning recognition that they had spent years offering advice and criticism based on fundamental misunderstanding of both my goals and my progress toward achieving them. Thank you, I said. I appreciate that acknowledgement, but I want you to understand something important about what happened here tonight. This publishing contract does not make my work valuable. My work was always valuable. This contract makes my work visible and financially rewarded, which are different things entirely. I paused to let that distinction settle before continuing. For 6 years, I chose to invest my time, energy, and resources in creating something that I believed was worth creating, regardless of whether it would ever be recognized or rewarded by others. That choice required courage, discipline, and faith in my own judgment, even when the people closest to me considered those qualities evidence of poor decision-making and unrealistic expectations. The birthday celebration that had begun with confident assertions about practical career choices and responsible life planning had transformed into a more complex conversation about the nature of success, the limitations of conventional wisdom, and the courage required to pursue goals that cannot be easily evaluated or understood by others. Tonight, you learned that I was not the failure you thought I was, I continued. But I hope you also learned something more important, that success often requires working toward goals that other people cannot see, believing in possibilities that other people consider unrealistic, and maintaining commitment to your vision, even when the people who love you most are trying to convince you to abandon it. The evening concluded with subdued congratulations, awkward apologies, and the recognition that family relationships would need to be rebuilt on foundations that acknowledged capabilities and achievements that had always existed but had not been visible to people who were looking for different kinds of evidence. But as I drove home that night to my converted garage apartment in the Arts District, I was not thinking about vindication or family dynamics or the satisfaction of proving skeptics wrong. I was thinking about the years of work that had brought me to this moment, the persistence required to continue writing when no one believed in the value of what I was creating, and the quiet satisfaction that comes from achieving something meaningful through sustained effort and unwavering commitment to your own vision. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of working with Beacon Press to bring The Weight of Silence to readers who would connect with its themes and characters. But tonight, I was simply grateful for the reminder that success is not about convincing other people of your worth. Success is about creating something valuable and finding the people who recognize that value when they encounter it. If you are currently pursuing goals that other people do not understand or support, remember that their inability to see your vision does not diminish the validity of your work. Keep building, keep learning, keep creating. Sometimes the people who call you a failure are simply people who have not yet learned how to recognize the kind of success you are building. And remember, the most powerful transformations happen not when you prove others wrong, but when you prove yourself right. The path to that transformative phone call began 6 years earlier in the corporate offices of Henderson Marketing Solutions, where I occupied a corner cubicle and spent my days crafting promotional materials for clients whose products I rarely understood and whose success I never witnessed firsthand. The irony was not lost on me that I was using my writing skills to help other people achieve their dreams, while my own remained locked away in private notebooks that I carried everywhere but never showed to anyone. Henderson Marketing was the kind of mid-tier agency that specialized in serving regional businesses with modest budgets and predictable needs. Our client roster included dental practices, insurance agencies, small manufacturing companies, and local service providers who required competent but uninspired marketing communications that would help them maintain market share without necessarily expanding their reach or influence. The work was steady, adequately compensated, and completely devoid of creative challenge or personal fulfillment. My colleagues were pleasant people who had found comfortable niches within the marketing industry and who approached their work with professional competence rather than passionate engagement. They arrived each morning at precisely the same time, followed established routines for managing their assigned accounts, and departed each evening with the satisfaction of having completed another day of productive but unremarkable labor. For 3 years, I had successfully inhabited this world of predictable schedules and measurable outcomes. I had earned promotions, received positive performance evaluations, and accumulated the kind of resume credentials that demonstrated my ability to function effectively within corporate environments. My family viewed my position at Henderson Marketing as evidence of responsible career development and practical decision-making, particularly given the economic uncertainty that characterized many industries during that period. But beneath the surface of professional competence and career advancement, I was experiencing a growing sense of disconnection from work that utilized only a fraction of my capabilities and interests. The marketing copy I wrote for dental practices and insurance agencies represented efficient communication rather than meaningful expression. The promotional campaigns I developed for manufacturing companies achieved their intended objectives without addressing questions or themes that felt important or lasting. Most significantly, I had begun to notice that my most engaged and energetic writing occurred not during business hours when I was being compensated for my efforts, but during evenings and weekends when I worked on personal projects that no one expected me to complete and that served no obvious practical purpose beyond my own creative satisfaction. The realization that led to my eventual departure from Henderson Marketing emerged gradually through a series of small observations and accumulated frustrations that eventually coalesced into a clear understanding of what I needed to pursue and why traditional employment could not provide the platform for that pursuit. The first catalyst occurred during a client meeting with the owner of a small publishing company that specialized in regional history books and local interest publications. David Hendricks had built Rocky Mountain Press through decades of patient relationship building with Colorado authors, historians, and cultural organizations who needed professional publishing services for projects that larger publishing houses would consider too specialized or commercially limited. During our initial consultation, David described his company's mission in terms that resonated with something deep in my creative consciousness. Rocky Mountain Press existed to ensure that important stories were preserved and shared, regardless of whether those stories would generate significant financial returns or attract national attention. The company's success was measured not only by sales figures and profit margins, but by the cultural value of the books they produced and the relationships they maintained with authors whose work might otherwise remain unpublished. As I developed marketing materials for Rocky Mountain Press, I found myself studying their catalog with fascination rather than professional detachment. The books they published explored themes of identity, belonging, cultural preservation, and the complex dynamics of communities navigating change while maintaining connection to their historical foundations. These were precisely the subjects that occupied my thoughts during private moments when I allowed myself to imagine what I might write if I had the courage to pursue serious literary work. More importantly, my interactions with David Hendricks provided insights into the publishing industry that contradicted many of the assumptions that had prevented me from considering writing as a viable career option. David explained that successful publishing relationships were built on mutual respect between authors and publishers, shared commitment to producing quality work, and realistic understanding of market dynamics, rather than unrealistic expectations about financial outcomes or commercial success. Through conversations with David and exposure to the authors in Rocky Mountain Press's catalog, I began to understand that publishing was not the impossibly exclusive industry that my family had described, but rather a complex ecosystem that included opportunities for writers who were willing to approach their craft with professionalism, persistence, and realistic expectations about the development process required to produce publishable work. The second catalyst emerged from my growing awareness of the limitations imposed by my current work environment. Henderson Marketing served clients who needed competent communication services, But the company culture did not encourage innovation, creative risk-taking, or the development of capabilities that extended beyond established service offerings. My colleagues were skilled professionals who had found sustainable career paths within the marketing industry, but none of them were pursuing creative work that might serve as a foundation for alternative career development. I began to recognize that remaining at Henderson Marketing would provide financial security and professional advancement within a clearly defined trajectory, but it would not provide the time, energy, or creative stimulation necessary to develop the writing capabilities that had become increasingly important to my sense of personal fulfillment and long-term goals. The third catalyst was the most personal and ultimately the most powerful. During a family gathering similar to the birthday dinner where I would later receive Margaret Thornton's call, my grandmother shared stories about her own unfulfilled creative aspirations and the choices she had made that prioritized family security over personal artistic development. My grandmother, Elena Rodriguez, had immigrated to Colorado from Mexico in 1952 with dreams of becoming a teacher and eventually writing children's books that would help young Mexican-American students see themselves reflected in literature. Instead, economic necessity and family responsibilities had directed her toward factory work and domestic labor that provided immediate income but offered no opportunities for intellectual growth or creative expression. Elena had spent decades supporting her family through jobs that utilized her physical energy and practical skills, while her educational aspirations and creative interests remained dormant. By the time her children were financially independent and she had the freedom to pursue personal goals, she felt too disconnected from academic environments and too uncertain about her abilities to attempt the writing career she had once envisioned. As I listened to my grandmother describe the choices she had made and the dreams she had abandoned, I realized that I was facing a similar crossroads between immediate security and long-term fulfillment. The difference was that I had advantages Elena had not possessed: education, financial resources, professional experience, and, most importantly, time to pursue alternative paths, before family obligations and economic pressures eliminated those options entirely. Elena's stories forced me to confront uncomfortable questions about my own priorities and the potential consequences of deferring creative work indefinitely, while I focused on building conventional career security. I began to understand that the safety of traditional employment could become a trap that prevented rather than enabled the achievement of meaningful personal goals. The decision to leave Henderson Marketing required 6 months of careful planning and preparation. I could not simply abandon steady employment without ensuring that I had sufficient financial resources to support myself during the transition period, and that I had developed the foundational skills necessary to pursue writing as a serious professional undertaking rather than as a casual hobby. I established a savings plan that would provide 18 months of living expenses, allowing me to focus on writing without the immediate pressure of generating income through freelance work or part-time employment. I researched writing programs, workshops, and educational resources that would help me develop technical skills and industry knowledge that I lacked from my corporate communications background. Most importantly, I began writing consistently during evenings and weekends, treating this creative work with the same discipline and professionalism that I applied to my marketing responsibilities. I established daily writing routines, set weekly and monthly goals for manuscript development, and sought feedback from other writers through online communities and local writing groups. The story that eventually became The Weight of Silence emerged from this period of intensive creative exploration and skill development. Initially, I had planned to write something safer and more obviously commercial, perhaps a contemporary romance or a mystery novel that would fit clearly within established publishing categories and reader expectations. Instead, I found myself drawn to themes and characters that reflected my own experiences and observations about the complexities of cultural identity, family loyalty, and personal ambition within immigrant communities. The novel that developed through months of writing, revision, and refinement became a meditation on the tensions between honoring family traditions and pursuing individual dreams, between maintaining cultural connections and embracing opportunities for growth and change. The 3 generations of women at the center of The Weight of Silence represented different approaches to navigating these tensions. The grandmother character, inspired by Elena's experiences, had sacrificed personal aspirations for family security and cultural preservation. The mother character had achieved professional success through strategic assimilation, but had lost connection to cultural traditions and creative expression. The daughter character was attempting to find a path that honored both heritage and individual ambition, without requiring complete sacrifice of either. Writing this novel required research into Mexican-American history, immigration patterns, cultural traditions, and contemporary social dynamics that extended far beyond my personal experience and family background. I spent months studying academic sources, conducting interviews with community members, and exploring literature by other Mexican-American authors whose work addressed similar themes from different perspectives and time periods. The research process became as engaging and educational as the actual writing, providing insights into historical contexts and cultural complexities that enriched both my understanding of the story I was trying to tell and my appreciation for the broader literary tradition within which my work would be situated. But the most challenging aspect of developing The Weight of Silence was learning to trust my own voice and perspective while writing about experiences and themes that felt deeply personal and potentially vulnerable to criticism or misunderstanding. Corporate communications had taught me to write for clearly defined audiences with predictable expectations and measurable objectives. Literary fiction required me to write from authentic personal perspective, while creating universal themes that would resonate with readers whose backgrounds and experiences might differ significantly from my own. This transition from functional writing to creative expression required developing entirely different skills and approaches. I had to learn to create complex characters whose motivations and behaviors felt genuine rather than convenient for plot advancement. I had to develop narrative techniques that revealed character development and thematic depth through subtle storytelling rather than explicit explanation. Most importantly, I had to find ways to explore difficult questions about identity, belonging, and cultural change without providing simplistic answers or comfortable resolutions. The learning process was both exhilarating and frustrating. Some days, the writing flowed naturally, and I felt confident about the story I was creating and my ability to execute it effectively. Other days, I struggled with technical challenges, questioned my capability to handle complex themes, and wondered whether I was naive to believe that I could produce work that would meet professional publishing standards. During the most difficult periods, I relied on the writing community I had discovered through online forums and local workshops. These relationships provided both practical support in the form of feedback and editing assistance, and emotional support in the form of encouragement from other writers who understood the challenges of pursuing creative work without guaranteed outcomes or external validation. The community included published authors who shared insights about the publishing industry, aspiring writers who were navigating similar challenges and uncertainties, and readers who offered perspectives on how different themes and approaches might resonate with various audiences. These relationships became essential to my development as a writer and to my ability to maintain motivation during the inevitable periods of doubt and discouragement. After 2 years of intensive writing and revision, I had completed a first draft of The Weight of Silence that felt worthy of professional evaluation and potential publication consideration. However, I recognized that the manuscript required additional development and refinement before it would be ready for submission to publishers. I researched professional editing services and eventually hired Sarah Martinez, a freelance editor who specialized in literary fiction by Latino authors. Sarah's background provided both technical expertise in manuscript development and cultural insight into the themes and perspectives that formed the foundation of my novel. Working with Sarah was revelatory. She helped me identify structural weaknesses in the narrative, develop secondary characters who had remained underdeveloped in early drafts, and refine the prose style to achieve greater clarity and emotional impact. More importantly, she provided validation that the story I was telling was worth telling, and that I had developed the technical skills necessary to tell it effectively. The editing process required an additional year of revision and refinement, during which I learned to evaluate my own work more critically and to make difficult decisions about cutting material that I loved but that did not serve the overall effectiveness of the novel. I learned to distinguish between writing that pleased me personally and writing that would engage readers who approached the book without my personal investment in its themes and characters. By the 4th year of the project, I had produced a manuscript that felt ready for professional submission, but I still lacked the industry knowledge and connections necessary to navigate the publishing process effectively. I researched literary agents, publishing houses, and submission protocols through industry publications, writing conferences, and online resources that provided detailed guidance for aspiring authors. The submission process itself required another year of research, preparation, and strategic decision-making. I crafted query letters that summarized the novel effectively while highlighting its unique perspective and market potential. I wrote synopsis documents that captured the essential plot elements and thematic depth without revealing every detail of the story's development and resolution. I researched individual editors and publishers to ensure that my submissions were targeted appropriately to professionals who worked with similar material and who might be genuinely interested in the book I had written. The most challenging aspect of the submission process was managing the uncertainty and extended timeline that characterized communications with publishers. Unlike corporate projects that proceeded according to predictable schedules with regular updates and clear decision points, publishing submissions involved months of waiting with minimal communication and no guarantee of response or consideration. During this period, my family's patience with my writing career reached its lowest point. They could see that I was working consistently and seriously, but they could not evaluate my progress or prospects because the publishing industry operated according to timelines and criteria that differed dramatically from their professional experiences in business and journalism. The gap between my confidence in the project and their skepticism about its viability created increasing tension during family gatherings and personal conversations. Their concerns were rooted in genuine affection and worry about my financial security and professional development, but their inability to understand or respect the creative process felt like a fundamental rejection of everything that had become most important to me. The period leading up to Margaret Thornton's phone call represented the most challenging test of my commitment to this career path. I had invested 6 years of intensive work, significant financial resources, and enormous emotional energy in developing a novel that might never be published or read by anyone beyond the small circle of people who had provided feedback during its development. I had sacrificed job security, career advancement opportunities, and family approval in pursuit of a goal that remained uncertain despite my best efforts and professional preparation. I had reached the point where I could not continue indefinitely without some form of external validation or concrete evidence that my work had value beyond my personal satisfaction with the creative process. The birthday dinner where Sophia labeled me the family failure occurred at precisely the moment when I was most vulnerable to doubt and most in need of evidence that my choices had been justified. The cruel timing of her public humiliation made Margaret Thornton's call feel like vindication not only of my writing abilities, but of my decision to pursue creative work despite family opposition and industry uncertainty. But the most important lesson from those 6 years of development was not about persistence in the face of skepticism, although that was certainly required. The most important lesson was about learning to evaluate my own work and progress according to meaningful criteria, rather than external validation or approval from people who did not understand the nature of creative development, or the requirements for producing publishable literature. Success in writing required developing internal standards of excellence that were higher than industry requirements, personal discipline that exceeded what any employer or supervisor would demand, and creative vision that transcended market expectations or commercial considerations. The external validation provided by Margaret Thornton's call was deeply satisfying, but it confirmed rather than created the value of work that had always been valuable regardless of whether anyone else recognized its worth. The journey from corporate communications to published author required more than career transition or skill development. It required fundamental transformation of how I understood work, creativity, success, and the relationship between personal fulfillment and professional achievement. That transformation began in the shadows of doubt and uncertainty, but it created the foundation for everything that would follow when the world finally had the opportunity to encounter the story I had spent 6 years learning to tell. The 4th year of working on The Weight of Silence brought challenges that tested every assumption I had made about persistence, talent, and the relationship between dedication and achievement. What I had expected to be a period of refinement and preparation for publication became instead a crucible of doubt that forced me to confront the possibility that 6 years of work might never translate into the professional recognition I had sacrificed so much to pursue. The manuscript that I had believed was approaching completion revealed itself to be fundamentally flawed in ways that I had not recognized, despite months of revision and self-evaluation. The plot structure that had seemed coherent during early drafts began to feel contrived and predictable when I attempted to refine it for professional submission. Characters who had felt authentic and compelling in isolation failed to create meaningful relationships and conflicts when I examined their interactions more critically. Most devastatingly, the themes that formed the emotional and intellectual foundation of the novel seemed to resist the narrative techniques I was using to explore them. The complex questions about cultural identity, family loyalty, and personal ambition that had inspired my initial interest in this story proved far more difficult to address through fiction than I had anticipated. Every attempt to develop these themes through character development and plot advancement felt either oversimplified or overwrought, failing to capture the nuanced reality of the experiences I was trying to represent. The realization that my manuscript required fundamental restructuring rather than superficial editing arrived through a series of increasingly honest assessments from beta readers, whose feedback I had sought after completing what I thought was a final draft. These readers, who included both published authors and avid consumers of literary fiction, provided detailed critiques that identified structural weaknesses, pacing problems, and thematic inconsistencies that I had become too close to the material to recognize. Jennifer Chen, a novelist whose debut had been published by a prestigious literary press 3 years earlier, delivered the most comprehensive and devastating evaluation of my work. Her 15-page written assessment praised my prose style and character development, while systematically dismantling the narrative structure and thematic development that I had considered the strengths of the novel. Jennifer explained that while individual scenes and chapters demonstrated strong writing skills, the overall trajectory of the story failed to create the emotional journey that readers required to remain engaged with the characters and invested in their outcomes. The pacing moved too slowly during the first third of the book, then accelerated too rapidly during the final third, creating an uneven reading experience that would frustrate both editors and general audiences. More fundamentally, Jennifer identified a disconnect between the serious themes I was attempting to explore and the relatively conventional plot structure I was using to examine those themes. The novel needed either a more innovative narrative approach that matched the complexity of its subject matter, or a more focused thematic scope that could be effectively developed within traditional storytelling frameworks. Her assessment concluded with encouragement about my potential as a writer, combined with realistic guidance about the amount of additional work required to transform the current manuscript into a publishable novel. Jennifer estimated that addressing the structural and thematic problems she had identified would require at least 18 months of intensive revision, assuming that I could develop the technical skills necessary to execute the more sophisticated narrative approach that the material demanded. The feedback from other beta readers echoed Jennifer's assessment in less detailed but equally discouraging terms. Marcus Williams, a literature professor who specialized in contemporary Latino fiction, praised the authenticity of the cultural perspectives, but questioned whether the story offered sufficient insight or innovation to distinguish it from other novels that explored similar themes. Rebecca Torres, a literary agent who had agreed to provide informal feedback as a favor to a mutual acquaintance, suggested that the manuscript felt more like a first novel by a promising writer than like a ready-for-publication work by an author who had mastered the craft requirements for commercial success. The cumulative effect of this professional feedback was to force me to acknowledge that I had significantly underestimated both the complexity of the story I was attempting to tell and the level of technical expertise required to tell it effectively. The 6 years I had devoted to developing this novel had taught me fundamental writing skills and had produced a manuscript that demonstrated my potential as an author, but had not yet resulted in a book that was ready for professional publication. This recognition arrived at the worst possible time in terms of my personal circumstances and family relationships. My savings were approaching depletion after 4 years of reduced income and manuscript development expenses. My family's patience with my writing career had deteriorated to the point where conversations about my future had become tense confrontations about responsibility, practicality, and the need to return to conventional employment before my resume gap became too extensive to overcome. Most painfully, I was beginning to question my own judgment about my capabilities and prospects as a writer. The confidence I had built through years of consistent work and steady improvement was undermined by the realization that improvement and readiness for publication were not equivalent, and that I might need several more years of development before producing work that met industry standards for commercial publication. The psychological challenge of accepting this extended timeline was compounded by the isolation that had gradually developed around my writing career. Most of my former colleagues at Henderson Marketing had lost touch with me as our professional and social circumstances diverged. My family relationships had become strained by their inability to understand or support my choices. Even within the writing community that had provided encouragement and feedback, I felt increasingly disconnected from other authors whose careers were progressing more rapidly, or whose work seemed to develop more naturally toward publication readiness. The period between receiving the beta reader feedback and deciding how to proceed with the manuscript revision became the most difficult test of my commitment to writing that I had experienced. For the first time since leaving corporate employment, I seriously considered the possibility that my family might be correct about the impracticality of pursuing a writing career, and that I might need to abandon this project in favor of returning to conventional work that would provide immediate income and long-term financial security. The decision to continue working on the novel, despite these challenges, required fundamental reassessment of my goals, timeline, and definition of success. I could no longer approach the writing process with the assumption that dedication and persistence would automatically lead to publication within a predictable time frame. Instead, I needed to develop a more mature and realistic understanding of creative development that acknowledged the possibility of extended periods of growth and learning that might not produce immediate measurable results. I established new criteria for evaluating my progress that focused on skill development and artistic growth rather than publication readiness or commercial viability. Each month, instead of measuring advancement toward a finished manuscript, I assessed whether my understanding of character development, narrative structure, thematic exploration, and prose style had improved through my revision work. This approach allowed me to maintain motivation and direction, even when the specific revisions I was implementing seemed to move me further from, rather than closer to a publishable draft. The revision process that followed was more systematic and educational than any writing work I had previously undertaken. Instead of attempting to fix the existing manuscript through incremental improvements, I decided to completely reconstruct the novel using the technical knowledge and thematic insights I had gained through the beta reader feedback and my own continued study of contemporary literary fiction. I began by creating detailed character profiles that went far beyond the basic biographical information I had developed for earlier drafts. These new profiles explored the psychological motivations, cultural influences, historical contexts, and personal relationships that shaped how each character would respond to the conflicts and challenges that drove the story forward. I spent weeks developing backstories and personality traits that would never appear directly in the novel, but that would inform every interaction and decision that occurred within the narrative. The plot restructuring required even more extensive preparation and analysis. I studied successful novels that dealt with similar themes to understand how other authors had balanced character development with narrative momentum, how they had integrated cultural and historical context without overwhelming the personal story, and how they had achieved thematic depth without sacrificing accessibility for general readers. I created detailed outlines that mapped not only the sequence of events that would occur in each chapter, but also the emotional journey that each character would experience, the thematic elements that would be developed or revealed, and the pacing strategies that would maintain reader engagement while allowing adequate development of complex ideas and relationships. The actual writing of the revised manuscript proceeded much more slowly than my earlier drafts, but with far greater confidence and technical sophistication. Instead of discovering the story through the writing process, I was now implementing a carefully planned narrative strategy that had been developed through months of preparation and research. Each scene had specific objectives in terms of character development, plot advancement, and thematic exploration, and I could evaluate my success in achieving those objectives as I completed each section. The most significant improvement in this revision involved the integration of cultural and historical elements into the personal narrative. Earlier drafts had treated the characters' Mexican-American heritage as background information that provided context for their decisions and relationships. The revised version made cultural identity an active force that shaped the conflicts and opportunities that each character encountered, creating a more authentic and emotionally resonant exploration of how heritage influences individual development and family dynamics. I also developed more sophisticated approaches to addressing the complex themes that had attracted me to this story originally. Instead of attempting to provide comprehensive analysis of cultural assimilation, intergenerational conflict, and personal ambition through explicit narrative commentary, I learned to embed these explorations within character interactions and plot developments that allowed readers to develop their own insights and conclusions about the questions the novel was raising. The revision process required 15 months of intensive work that often felt more demanding than the original writing had been. The technical challenges of restructuring an existing manuscript while maintaining narrative coherence and character consistency were complicated by the emotional difficulty of acknowledging that my earlier work had been inadequate, despite the enormous investment of time and energy it had represented. During the most frustrating periods of this revision, I relied heavily on the writing community relationships I had developed through online forums and local workshops. These connections provided both practical support in the form of feedback on revised chapters and emotional support through encouragement from other authors who had experienced similar challenges in their own creative development. The community included several published authors who shared detailed accounts of their own revision experiences, helping me understand that extensive reconstruction of manuscripts was a normal part of the professional writing process, rather than evidence of fundamental inadequacy or poor initial planning. These conversations normalized the frustrations and setbacks I was experiencing, while providing concrete examples of how persistence through difficult revision periods had ultimately led to successful publication for other writers. More importantly, these relationships helped me develop a more mature understanding of writing as a craft that required ongoing development and refinement, rather than as a talent that either existed naturally or could be acquired through a predictable learning process. I began to appreciate that the challenges I was facing were opportunities for growth rather than obstacles to overcome, and that the technical skills I was developing through this difficult revision would serve as foundations for more sophisticated work in future projects. The revised manuscript that emerged from this 15-month process was substantially different from the original version in terms of structure, pacing, character development, and thematic sophistication. The story still followed the same basic premise and explored the same fundamental questions about cultural identity and family relationships, but it did so through narrative techniques that were far more effective at engaging readers and developing complex ideas through character-driven storytelling. Most significantly, the revised version felt like the work of a mature author who had mastered the technical requirements for literary fiction, rather than like the promising but underdeveloped effort of a talented beginning writer. The prose style was more polished and confident, the character development was more nuanced and authentic, and the thematic exploration was more subtle and emotionally compelling. However, completing this extensive revision created new challenges related to my personal circumstances and family relationships. The additional time required for manuscript development had exhausted my financial reserves and had pushed my departure from conventional employment to almost 5 years. My family's concerns about my career choices had intensified as the timeline for achieving publication continued to extend without concrete evidence of progress toward professional recognition or financial viability. The gap between my own assessment of the revised manuscript's quality and my family's ability to evaluate that improvement created increasing tension during personal interactions. I was more confident than ever about the novel's potential for publication and commercial success, but I could not provide the external validation or measurable progress indicators that my family required to support my continued commitment to writing. This disconnect became particularly painful during family gatherings where my professional situation was compared implicitly or explicitly to my siblings' continued advancement within their respective career tracks. Miguel's promotion to senior vice president had been accompanied by stock options and a salary increase that provided clear evidence of professional success and financial security. Sophia's journalism career had produced a regular series of published articles, industry recognition, and networking opportunities that demonstrated steady progress toward her goal of national media prominence. My writing career, despite the enormous personal and professional growth I had experienced, remained invisible to external evaluation and appeared to my family to represent stagnation rather than development. The novel that consumed my time and energy existed only as a private manuscript that they could not assess, and that provided no evidence of the skills I was developing or the progress I was making toward publication readiness. The period immediately before my birthday dinner represented the culmination of these various pressures and uncertainties. I had completed the extensive revision of The Weight of Silence and believed that it was finally ready for professional submission, but I had not yet begun the submission process because I was still researching publishers and preparing the query letters and synopsis materials that would be required for effective presentation to industry professionals. From my perspective, I was closer to achieving publication than I had ever been, with a manuscript that represented 6 years of dedicated development and sophisticated understanding of both creative writing techniques and publishing industry requirements. From my family's perspective, I was approaching the end of my 5th year of unemployment, with no concrete evidence of progress toward professional recognition or financial independence. The birthday dinner where Sophia labeled me the family failure occurred at precisely the moment when this gap between my confidence and their skepticism was most pronounced. I had recently completed work that I believed would finally validate my career choices and demonstrate the value of the time and resources I had invested in writing development. They saw only continued absence of external recognition and growing concerns about my long-term financial prospects and professional viability. The cruel timing of Sophia's public humiliation made Margaret Thornton's call feel like vindication not only of my writing abilities, but of my decision to persist through years of doubt and revision, when the easiest choice would have been to abandon the project and return to conventional employment. The recognition that The Weight of Silence had achieved publication readiness at precisely the moment when my family's patience had reached its breaking point seemed to validate everything I had believed about the value of persistence and the importance of maintaining commitment to meaningful work despite external pressure and uncertainty. But the most important lesson from those difficult years of revision and doubt was not about the eventual vindication of my choices, although that vindication was deeply satisfying. The most important lesson was about learning to evaluate creative work according to internal standards of excellence rather than external markers of progress, and about developing the emotional resilience necessary to continue pursuing meaningful goals, even when the timeline for achieving those goals extends beyond initial expectations or external patience. The years I spent revising The Weight of Silence taught me that creative development follows patterns that are fundamentally different from conventional career advancement, and that success in writing requires comfort with uncertainty, extended periods of growth without measurable progress, and faith in the value of work that may not be recognized or rewarded for years after it is completed. These lessons would prove essential not only for navigating the publication process that would follow Margaret Thornton's call, but for sustaining a long-term writing career that would inevitably include future periods of challenge, revision, and uncertainty about outcomes. The dark valley of doubt and extensive revision had been necessary preparation for the recognition that was finally arriving, but it had also been preparation for the ongoing challenges and opportunities that would characterize my development as a professional author. The completion of the revised manuscript marked the beginning of an entirely new phase of my writing journey, one that required skills and knowledge completely different from the creative and technical capabilities I had developed during the years of writing and revision. The publishing industry operated according to protocols, hierarchies, and business considerations that bore little resemblance to the artistic and intellectual challenges I had been addressing through my work on The Weight of Silence. Understanding how to navigate this complex system became a full-time educational undertaking that demanded the same systematic approach and persistent effort that I had applied to learning the craft of fiction writing. The difference was that this education focused on commercial realities, professional relationships, and strategic communication rather than on character development, narrative structure, and thematic exploration. The first challenge involved determining whether to pursue publication through traditional publishing houses, or through literary agents who specialized in representing authors to publishers. The conventional wisdom within the writing community suggested that securing representation by a reputable literary agent was essential for gaining access to major publishing houses. But the process of identifying and approaching appropriate agents presented its own formidable obstacles. Literary agents functioned as gatekeepers who filtered the enormous volume of manuscript submissions that publishers received. But they also operated highly selective businesses that could afford to represent only authors whose work demonstrated clear commercial potential and professional readiness. The most successful agents maintained client rosters of established authors who generated consistent income through regular publication schedules, making them reluctant to invest time and resources in developing emerging writers whose careers remained uncertain. Research into the literary representation industry revealed a frustrating circular challenge. Emerging authors needed agent representation to access major publishers, but agents were primarily interested in representing authors who had already achieved publication success through major publishers. Breaking into this closed system required finding agents who specialized in developing new talent, or who had specific interest in the themes and demographics represented in particular manuscripts. I spent 3 months researching literary agents who represented Latino authors, debut novelists, or literary fiction that explored themes of cultural identity and family dynamics. This research involved studying acknowledgement sections of recently published novels that shared characteristics with my own work, investigating agent websites and client lists, and analyzing submission guidelines to understand the specific materials and approaches that different agencies preferred. The process revealed significant variations in how different agents preferred to be approached, what materials they required for initial evaluation, and how they communicated with prospective clients throughout the submission and review process. Some agents requested only query letters for initial contact, while others required complete submission packages that included detailed synopsis documents, author biographies, and sample chapters. Response times ranged from 2 weeks to 6 months, and some agencies explicitly stated that no response should be interpreted as rejection. Creating effective query letters required distilling 6 years of creative work into a single page that captured the essence of the novel's plot, themes, and market appeal, while demonstrating my qualifications as an author and my understanding of the publishing industry. Each query letter needed to be customized for the specific agent receiving it, incorporating references to their client list, recent sales, or published interviews that demonstrated genuine research and targeted interest rather than mass distribution of generic materials. The synopsis writing presented even greater challenges, requiring me to summarize the complete narrative arc of The Weight of Silence in 2 to 5 pages, while maintaining the emotional impact and thematic sophistication that characterized the full manuscript. Unlike marketing summaries that focused on highlighting exciting plot elements, literary synopsis documents needed to demonstrate narrative structure, character development, and thematic depth while revealing the complete resolution of all major conflicts and character journeys. I revised these submission materials dozens of times, seeking feedback from other writers who had successfully navigated the agent acquisition process, and studying examples of effective query letters and synopsis documents that had resulted in representation offers. The precision required for these brief documents was different from but no less demanding than the extended character and plot development work that had occupied the previous years of manuscript revision. After 4 months of preparation, I began submitting to carefully selected literary agents, whose backgrounds and client interests aligned with my novel's themes and market positioning. I limited initial submissions to 5 agents, planning to evaluate their responses before expanding to additional prospects. This conservative approach was designed to allow me to refine my submission materials based on early feedback, while preserving the opportunity to approach other agents if initial responses were negative. The waiting period that followed these submissions was psychologically challenging in ways that I had not anticipated. Unlike the manuscript development process where I maintained complete control over timeline and progress, the submission process required patience and acceptance of extended periods without communication or feedback. Agents operated according to their own priorities and schedules, and prospective clients had no influence over review timelines or decision-making processes. During this waiting period, my family's skepticism about my writing career intensified as they observed me experiencing stress and uncertainty about outcomes that remained completely outside my control. The confidence I had built through completing the revised manuscript was undermined by the reality that publication depended not only on the quality of my work, but on finding industry professionals who recognized that quality and believed they could market it successfully to publishers and readers. My father, who had built his accounting practice through systematic business development and measurable client relationship management, was particularly frustrated by the apparent randomness and inefficiency of the literary submission process. From his perspective, I had developed a product that I believed met market requirements, but I was pursuing a distribution strategy that provided no predictable timeline for results and no clear criteria for success or failure. Miguel, whose corporate experience involved quarterly performance evaluations and annual advancement opportunities, could not understand why the publishing industry operated without systematic feedback mechanisms or transparent decision-making processes. His suggestion that I consider self-publishing options reflected his belief that entrepreneurial approaches would provide greater control over outcomes and timelines than traditional industry gatekeeping systems. Sophia, despite her journalism background and familiarity with publishing environments, remained skeptical about the commercial viability of literary fiction and the likelihood that my particular manuscript would attract sufficient industry interest to justify the time and resources I had invested in its development. Her knowledge of media economics led her to emphasize the declining book sales, reduced publisher marketing budgets, and increasing competition from digital entertainment options that challenged the traditional book publishing business model. The first responses from literary agents arrived after 6 weeks of waiting and were uniformly negative, though they varied in tone and specificity of feedback. 2 agents sent form rejection letters that provided no explanation for their decision and no suggestions for improvement or alternative approaches. One agent included a brief personal note acknowledging the quality of my writing, while explaining that the current market conditions made literary fiction particularly difficult to place with publishers. The most detailed response came from Patricia Mendez, an agent who specialized in Latino literature and who had represented several successful debut novelists during the previous 5 years. Patricia's letter praised the authenticity of my cultural perspective and the sophistication of my prose style, while explaining that she did not believe she could effectively market a novel that focused primarily on intergenerational family dynamics, without more prominent contemporary social or political elements that would attract media attention and broader reader interest. Patricia's feedback forced me to confront the possibility that The Weight of Silence, despite its literary quality and personal significance, might not align with current market preferences for Latino fiction that addressed more explicitly political themes or contemporary social issues. The publishing industry's approach to marketing books by Latino authors appeared to favor works that could be positioned within existing cultural conversations about immigration, discrimination, or political activism, rather than more personal explorations of family relationships and individual identity development. This realization required me to reassess my understanding of how literary merit related to commercial viability, and to consider whether I needed to revise my marketing approach or my expectations about the types of publishers who might be interested in my work. The challenge was determining whether to modify the novel to better align with apparent market preferences, or to continue pursuing publishers who might appreciate the book's existing thematic focus and narrative approach. I decided to continue with my original submission strategy, while simultaneously researching smaller publishers who specialized in literary fiction and who might be more interested in artistic merit than in obvious commercial positioning. This parallel approach would allow me to test both the traditional agent-to-publisher pathway and the direct submission route that some emerging authors use to bypass the literary representation requirement. Direct submission to publishers required different research and preparation strategies than agent submissions had involved. Publishing houses that accepted unagented submissions typically served smaller markets and operated with more limited marketing budgets, but they also maintained editorial perspectives that prioritized literary quality over broad commercial appeal. These publishers often specialized in specific genres, demographic markets, or thematic approaches that aligned more closely with particular manuscripts than large commercial publishers could accommodate. I identified 12 small to medium-sized publishers whose catalogs included recent debut novels by Latino authors or literary fiction that explored similar themes to those developed in The Weight of Silence. These publishers included university presses that maintained trade fiction programs, independent literary presses that had achieved critical recognition for debut novelist development, and specialty publishers that focused specifically on multicultural American literature. The submission requirements for direct publisher contact were generally more extensive than agent submissions had required, often including complete manuscripts rather than sample chapters, detailed author biographies that demonstrated cultural authenticity and literary preparation, and marketing plans that explained how authors would contribute to promotional efforts for their published works. Preparing these comprehensive submission packages required additional months of research and writing, but the process was educational in ways that enhanced my understanding of how publishers evaluated manuscripts and how successful authors participated in the business aspects of literary careers. I developed detailed marketing proposals that identified target readership demographics, potential media outlets for publicity efforts, and networking opportunities within Latino literary communities that could support book promotion activities. The most challenging aspect of direct publisher submissions was managing the extended timeline required for editorial review processes. Publishers that accepted unagented submissions typically operated with smaller editorial staffs and larger submission volumes, resulting in response times that extended from 4 to 12 months. This timeline meant that I would be waiting nearly a year for definitive responses about publication opportunities, during which my family's patience with my career choices would continue to deteriorate. During this extended waiting period, I continued revising and refining The Weight of Silence, based on feedback from beta readers and my own continued development as a writer. I also began preliminary work on a second novel, recognizing that sustainable writing careers typically required multiple projects rather than dependence on single manuscript success. This forward momentum helped maintain my confidence and professional development, despite the uncertainty surrounding publication prospects for my completed novel. However, the combination of extended submission timelines and continued family skepticism created increasing personal stress that affected both my writing productivity and my relationships with relatives who remained convinced that I was pursuing an impractical career path that would ultimately require abandonment in favor of conventional employment. The situation was further complicated by my deteriorating financial circumstances. 5 years after leaving Henderson Marketing, my savings were nearly exhausted, and I was approaching the point where I would need to seek part-time employment to cover basic living expenses. The prospect of returning to work that would reduce my available time for writing activities felt like partial admission that my family's concerns about career practicality had been justified. My parents offered several times to provide financial support that would allow me to continue writing while also returning to corporate work that would demonstrate progress toward long-term career stability. Their willingness to help was generous and well-intentioned, but accepting their assistance would have required acknowledging that my writing career had failed to achieve the independence and professional recognition that I had pursued through 6 years of dedicated effort. The tension between practical necessity and creative commitment reached its peak during the months immediately preceding my birthday dinner. I had received encouraging but ultimately negative responses from several publishers who praised my writing ability, while explaining that they could not offer publication contracts for manuscripts that did not align closely with their current marketing strategies or editorial priorities. The most painful rejection came from Mountain West Literary Press, a publisher whose catalog included numerous debut novels by Latino authors, and whose editorial mission explicitly emphasized supporting emerging voices in contemporary American literature. Editor-in-Chief David Rodriguez wrote a detailed letter explaining that while The Weight of Silence demonstrated exceptional literary quality and cultural authenticity, the press had recently published several novels that explored similar themes and could not justify acquiring another manuscript that would compete with their existing titles for the same target readership. David's rejection was particularly discouraging because it suggested that the market for the type of book I had written was not only limited but potentially saturated with recent publications that would overshadow any new entries in the same thematic category. The possibility that I had spent 6 years developing a high-quality manuscript for a market niche that was already adequately served by other authors was devastating to contemplate. By the time my birthday dinner arrived, I was facing the most serious crisis of confidence I had experienced since beginning my writing career. Despite producing work that consistently received praise for its literary merit and cultural authenticity, I had been unable to secure either agent representation or publisher interest after more than 8 months of systematic submissions. The gap between critical recognition of my writing ability and commercial interest in my manuscript suggested that talent and persistence were not sufficient to guarantee publication success. The family gathering that would culminate in Sophia's cruel toast occurred at precisely the moment when my own doubts about my career choices were most pronounced. I was beginning to seriously consider the possibility that my relatives had been correct about the impracticality of pursuing writing as a primary career focus, and that I might need to abandon my literary ambitions in favor of returning to conventional employment that would provide immediate financial security and long-term professional development opportunities. The birthday dinner conversation that led to my public humiliation as the family failure represented the convergence of external skepticism and internal uncertainty about whether 6 years of dedicated creative work would ever translate into the professional recognition and financial independence that I had sacrificed so much to pursue. My family's inability to understand or respect the submission process challenges reflected their legitimate concerns about my career trajectory, combined with their lack of knowledge about how creative industries operated differently from the business and journalism environments that had provided their own professional success. The psychological impact of Sophia's toast was magnified by my awareness that her characterization of me as a failure was based on external evidence that appeared to support her assessment. After 6 years of writing development and 8 months of publisher submissions, I had no concrete achievements to demonstrate that my career choices had been justified, or that my prospects for future success were realistic rather than delusional. Margaret Thornton's phone call arrived at the exact moment when I was most vulnerable to self-doubt and most in need of external validation, that my persistence through years of challenge and uncertainty had been warranted, rather than misguided. The timing of that call transformed what could have been the final abandonment of my writing ambitions into the ultimate vindication of everything I had believed about the value of pursuing meaningful work despite obstacles and opposition. The most important lesson from those months of submission challenges was not about the eventual success that made all the rejection and uncertainty worthwhile, although that success was profoundly satisfying. The most important lesson was about developing resilience and perspective that allowed me to continue pursuing worthwhile goals even when external evidence suggested that success was unlikely or impossible. The submission process had taught me that creative careers require tolerance for extended periods of uncertainty and rejection, and that success often depends on finding the right match between creative work and industry professionals, rather than on achieving universal recognition or approval. The agents and publishers who rejected The Weight of Silence were not necessarily wrong about its commercial potential or market positioning, but they were not the right advocates for the particular story I had written and the particular readership it was designed to serve. The experience of facing potential failure while maintaining commitment to meaningful work had prepared me not only for the publication success that was about to arrive, but for the ongoing challenges and opportunities that would characterize a sustainable writing career built on persistence, professional development, and faith in the value of creating literature that mattered to me regardless of whether it achieved broad commercial recognition. The silence that followed my announcement about Beacon Press offering me a 3-book publishing contract was unlike any moment I had experienced in 31 years of family gatherings. It was not the comfortable quiet that occurs when people are processing good news, nor was it the awkward pause that follows uncomfortable revelations. This was the profound stillness that emerges when fundamental assumptions about reality require complete reconstruction. I remained standing at the head of the table, looking at faces that reflected a complex mixture of shock, confusion, embarrassment, and the dawning recognition that 6 years of family conversations had been based on incomplete information and flawed understanding. The people who had spent the evening explaining why my choices were impractical and my goals unrealistic were now confronting evidence that their assessment had been entirely incorrect. The psychological impact of this reversal extended far beyond simple surprise about my professional success. Each family member was simultaneously processing multiple layers of realization about their own judgment, their understanding of creative careers, and their treatment of someone whose work they had consistently dismissed without adequate knowledge or investigation. Miguel was the first to attempt a response, though his usual corporate communication skills seemed inadequate for addressing a situation that challenged everything he thought he understood about career development and professional success. His question about whether I was serious reflected not skepticism about my truthfulness, but fundamental disorientation about how such extraordinary news could emerge from circumstances that had appeared to represent failure rather than impending triumph. The financial details I provided about the advance created additional complexity for family members who had spent years worrying about my economic security and long-term financial planning. The sum exceeded what most of them earned annually in their established professional positions, transforming their perception of writing from an economically irresponsible hobby into a potentially lucrative career path that they had failed to recognize or understand. My father, whose accounting expertise had led him to emphasize the financial impracticality of creative careers, was now calculating figures that contradicted every assumption he had made about publishing economics and author compensation. The mathematical reality of a seven-figure advance payment forced him to acknowledge that his professional knowledge of business finance had not prepared him to evaluate the economic potential of industries outside his direct experience. The transformation in family dynamics became most apparent through the questions they began asking once the initial shock subsided. Instead of expressing concern about my career choices or offering advice about returning to conventional employment, they were now seeking information about how the publishing industry operated, what the contract terms included, and how I had managed to achieve such extraordinary professional recognition without their awareness or support. Sophia, who had delivered the cruel toast that labeled me the family failure only 20 minutes earlier, was now struggling with the immediate recognition that her characterization had been both publicly humiliating for me and professionally embarrassing for her, as someone whose journalism career was supposed to provide expertise about media and publishing industries. Her attempt to apologize reflected genuine remorse about her cruelty, but it also revealed her awareness that her misjudgment would be remembered by everyone present as evidence of poor professional analysis and personal insensitivity. My mother, who had spent months expressing concern about my financial security and professional development, was now confronting the reality that her attempts to redirect my career had been based on fundamental misunderstanding of my progress and prospects. Her question about how long I had been working on the book revealed her recognition that she had been observing and evaluating a process she had never adequately understood or investigated. The most profound shift occurred in how family members began discussing my writing career itself. Throughout the previous 6 years, they had referred to my work as a hobby, a phase, or an impractical pursuit that would eventually be abandoned in favor of more sensible career choices. Now they were asking detailed questions about publication timelines, marketing strategies, and future book projects, treating my writing as a serious professional undertaking that warranted the same respect and attention they devoted to business ventures and career opportunities. David and Susan Chen, whose presence had added weight to the family's assessment of my career choices, were now reconsidering their own understanding of creative industries and the potential for non-traditional career paths to produce both artistic fulfillment and financial success. Their questions about the publishing contract reflected genuine curiosity about how creative careers developed and succeeded outside the conventional business frameworks they understood through their professional experience. Rachel, my brother's fiancée, who had suggested that I return to corporate communications for better financial security, was now observing that her human resources expertise had not prepared her to evaluate the potential of creative careers that operated according to different timelines and success metrics than corporate employment provided. Her reassessment of my career trajectory reflected broader recognition that professional development could follow paths that were less visible, but potentially more rewarding than conventional advancement within established corporate hierarchies. The evening continued with increasingly detailed discussions about the publishing industry, creative careers, and the challenges of pursuing professional goals that require extended development periods without regular external validation. These conversations revealed how little my family had understood about the work I had been doing, and the industry context within which that work was being evaluated and potentially rewarded. More significantly, the discussions began to address the broader implications of their misjudgment about my career choices and professional prospects. Each family member was recognizing that their skepticism had been based not on careful analysis of my work or realistic assessment of publishing industry opportunities, but on assumptions about creative careers that reflected their own professional experience, rather than knowledge about how literature and publishing actually operated. Miguel began asking questions about how creative industries measured success and advancement, acknowledging that his corporate background had not provided adequate framework for understanding career development that occurred through project completion, rather than systematic promotion within established organizational hierarchies. His curiosity about my daily work routines and long-term career planning reflected recognition that professional success could be achieved through approaches that differed significantly from the business strategies he had mastered. Sophia, despite her journalism background, admitted that her knowledge of newspaper and magazine publishing had not prepared her to understand book publishing or the development process required for novel writing. Her questions about my research methods, character development techniques, and thematic exploration revealed her growing appreciation for the intellectual and creative complexity of the work she had been dismissing as insufficiently rigorous or professionally meaningful. My parents began discussing their own assumptions about career security and professional achievement, acknowledging that their emphasis on conventional employment had reflected their understanding of economic stability rather than comprehensive knowledge about alternative career paths that might provide both personal fulfillment and financial independence. Their questions about publishing industry economics and author career development revealed their recognition that their advice had been based on incomplete information about the opportunities and challenges associated with creative professions. The conversation gradually evolved beyond immediate responses to my publishing success toward broader examination of how families evaluate and support career choices that extend beyond their direct experience or understanding. Each family member was recognizing that their approach to advising and supporting my career development had been shaped by their own professional backgrounds, rather than by adequate investigation of the specific industry and career path I was pursuing. This recognition led to more honest discussion about the challenges of maintaining family relationships, when individual career choices diverge significantly from established patterns of professional development and success measurement. My relatives began acknowledging that their skepticism about my writing career had reflected not only concern about my financial security, but discomfort with career choices that they could not easily evaluate or understand through their own professional experience. The most meaningful aspect of these evolving conversations was the recognition that success in creative careers required different forms of support and understanding than conventional professional development demanded. My family was beginning to understand that their attempts to redirect my career toward more familiar paths had reflected their own limitations rather than realistic assessment of my capabilities or prospects. However, the evening also revealed the complexity of rebuilding family relationships that had been strained by years of fundamental disagreement about career choices and professional priorities. While my publishing success had vindicated my decision to pursue writing, it had also highlighted the extent to which family support had been conditional on achieving external validation that aligned with their understanding of professional success. The process of rebuilding trust and mutual respect would require acknowledgement from both sides about the challenges of maintaining family relationships when individual goals and career paths diverge significantly from established expectations and familiar patterns. My relatives needed to recognize how their skepticism had affected our relationships and my confidence in their support, while I needed to understand that their concerns had been rooted in genuine affection and worry about my welfare rather than deliberate attempts to undermine my goals. The birthday dinner that had begun with confident assertions about practical career choices and responsible life planning concluded with more complex understanding about the nature of professional success, the challenges of evaluating unfamiliar career paths, and the importance of supporting family members whose goals extend beyond conventional definitions of achievement and security. As we prepared to leave the restaurant, the dynamic among family members had shifted in ways that would require ongoing adjustment and communication. The daughter they had labeled as irresponsible and impractical was now someone whose professional judgment and career development strategies had proved more sophisticated and successful than their own assessment had recognized. More importantly, the evening had demonstrated that extraordinary achievements often develop through processes that are invisible to external observation and evaluation. The 6 years of work that had appeared to represent stagnation or failure had actually been systematic preparation for professional success that exceeded anything any family member had achieved in their respective fields. The drive home to my converted garage apartment provided time for reflection about the profound changes in family dynamics that would follow this evening's revelations. The validation provided by Margaret Thornton's call was deeply satisfying, but it also created new challenges related to rebuilding relationships that had been damaged by years of mutual misunderstanding and inadequate communication about my goals and progress. The most significant realization was that external validation, however gratifying, could not repair the emotional impact of years during which the people closest to me had consistently questioned my judgment and dismissed my work without adequate understanding or investigation. The publishing contract confirmed the value of my writing, but it could not eliminate the memory of family gatherings where my career choices had been treated as evidence of poor decision-making rather than commitment to meaningful professional development. Rebuilding family relationships would require more than acknowledgement of my professional success. It would require developing new approaches to communication and support that recognized the validity of career paths that operated according to different timelines and success metrics than conventional employment provided. My relatives would need to learn how to evaluate and support creative work that might not produce visible progress for extended periods, while I would need to find ways to share my professional development and challenges that allowed them to understand and contribute to my career growth. The birthday dinner had marked a crucial turning point in family dynamics, but it had also revealed the ongoing work required to maintain supportive relationships when individual goals and career choices extend beyond familiar territory and established patterns of professional achievement. The celebration of my publishing success would need to be followed by sustained effort to rebuild trust and mutual understanding that had been compromised by years of disagreement about the viability and value of creative career development. The evening concluded with recognition that professional vindication, while profoundly satisfying, was only the beginning of the work required to transform family relationships and create sustainable support systems for ongoing creative career development. The phone call that had changed everything was not an endpoint, but rather the foundation for building new approaches to family communication and mutual support that could accommodate the realities of creative professional development and the extended timelines required for achieving recognition and success in literary careers. The most important lesson from this transformative evening was not about the satisfaction of proving skeptics wrong, although that satisfaction was genuine and meaningful. The most important lesson was about the complexity of family dynamics when individual career choices challenge established assumptions about professional development and success, and about the ongoing effort required to rebuild relationships based on mutual respect and understanding, rather than conditional support that depends on external validation and familiar patterns of achievement. The morning after my birthday dinner brought an entirely new set of challenges that I had not anticipated during 6 years of dreaming about publication success. Margaret Thornton's call had transformed my situation from aspiring writer to contracted author overnight, but it had also initiated a complex professional relationship that required skills and knowledge I had never needed to develop during the solitary years of manuscript creation and revision. The first indication of how dramatically my circumstances had changed arrived at 7:30 in the morning when my phone rang with a call from Jennifer Walsh, Beacon Press's Director of Author Relations. Jennifer's voice carried the efficient warmth of someone accustomed to managing multiple high-priority projects simultaneously, and her agenda for our conversation included scheduling decisions, contract discussions, and timeline coordination that needed to be resolved within the next 48 hours. The publishing contract that Margaret Thornton had described in general terms during her birthday evening call actually consisted of a comprehensive legal document that addressed dozens of specific issues related to manuscript delivery, editorial revision, marketing cooperation, subsidiary rights, and financial arrangements. Jennifer explained that I would need to review these terms with legal counsel before signing, and that Beacon Press expected to receive the signed agreement within 1 week to maintain their planned publication schedule. The urgency of these business requirements forced me to confront the reality that publication success required immediate transition from creative work to professional project management. The months I had expected to have for celebrating my achievement and gradually adjusting to my new status as a contracted author were being compressed into days of intensive decision-making about legal, financial, and career development issues that would affect my professional situation for years into the future. Jennifer's call also introduced me to the extensive support infrastructure that Beacon Press provided for their authors, but which came with corresponding expectations about author participation in promotional activities, editorial collaboration, and marketing initiatives. The publishing house was prepared to invest significant resources in developing and promoting The Weight of Silence, but their investment was contingent on my willingness to function as an active partner in the publication process, rather than as a passive recipient of their services. The editorial timeline Jennifer outlined required me to complete final manuscript revisions within 6 weeks, participate in comprehensive editing sessions during the following 2 months, and approve final page proofs and cover designs during the subsequent month. This schedule would culminate in publication 12 months from contract signing, with promotional activities beginning 3 months before the book's release date. The marketing plan that Jennifer described was more extensive than anything I had imagined during my years of hoping for publication. Beacon Press planned to coordinate book reviews in major literary publications, arrange author interviews with regional and national media outlets, organize reading events at bookstores and literary festivals, and develop social media campaigns that would reach potential readers who might be interested in contemporary Latino literature, or debut novels addressing themes of cultural identity and family relationships. However, these promotional opportunities came with professional obligations that would require significant personal and schedule adjustments. The marketing team expected me to be available for interviews, readings, and promotional events during the 6-month period surrounding the book's publication. They also required me to maintain active engagement with social media platforms, participate in virtual book club discussions, and coordinate with bookstore managers and literary event organizers who would be featuring The Weight of Silence in their programming. The financial arrangements, Jennifer explained, were more complex than Margaret Thornton's initial description had suggested. While the total advance payment was indeed substantial, it would be distributed across multiple installments tied to specific contract milestones, including manuscript delivery, editorial completion, and publication date. Additionally, the royalty structure included different percentage rates for various sales channels and market segments, making it difficult to predict actual earnings beyond the guaranteed advance payment. More significantly, the contract included provisions for international rights, translation opportunities, and potential film adaptation sales that could generate additional income, but which required ongoing participation in negotiations and promotional activities that might extend for years beyond the initial publication period. Success with The Weight of Silence could create opportunities for expanded career development, but it would also mean ongoing professional commitments that would need to be balanced with future writing projects and personal priorities. The conversation with Jennifer concluded with scheduling for my first visit to Beacon Press offices in New York, where I would meet the complete editorial and marketing teams, participate in preliminary promotional planning sessions, and begin the collaborative relationship that would guide The Weight of Silence through the publication process. This visit was scheduled for the following week, requiring immediate travel arrangements and preparation for professional meetings with people whose expertise and judgment would significantly influence my book's development and market reception. After ending the call with Jennifer, I sat in my converted garage apartment surrounded by the accumulated materials from 6 years of writing development, and contemplated the profound changes that were occurring in my professional and personal circumstances. The small space that had served as my creative sanctuary during the years of private writing was suddenly feeling inadequate for managing the complex business relationships and promotional activities that would characterize my new status as a published author. The next several hours brought additional calls from Beacon Press staff members who needed to coordinate various aspects of the publication process. The art department required detailed input about cover design preferences and author photograph requirements. The publicity team needed biographical information, personal background details, and preliminary thoughts about interview topics that would be relevant for media appearances. The legal department had specific questions about previous publications, potential copyright conflicts, and family consent for any personal experiences that had informed fictional elements in the novel. Each conversation revealed additional layers of professional complexity that I had not anticipated during my years of focusing exclusively on creative writing and manuscript development. Publishing a novel required collaboration with dozens of specialists whose expertise in marketing, design, publicity, legal affairs, and distribution logistics would directly affect how The Weight of Silence was presented to readers and how successfully it reached its intended audience. The educational curve was steep and demanding. I needed to develop rapid competency in areas including contract negotiation, media communication, event planning, and promotional strategy, while simultaneously maintaining focus on the editorial revisions that would be required to prepare the manuscript for final publication. The transition from solitary creative work to collaborative professional project management was more challenging than I had expected, requiring adjustment to schedules, priorities, and communication patterns that differed significantly from the writing routines I had established during the previous 6 years. However, the most significant challenge was psychological rather than logistical. After years of working in isolation without external validation or professional recognition, I was suddenly receiving intense attention from industry experts who treated my work as commercially valuable and culturally significant. The experience of being courted by publishing professionals who competed for my attention and cooperation was both gratifying and overwhelming, requiring emotional adjustment to circumstances that I had dreamed about but never actually experienced. The contrast with my family's recent skepticism was particularly striking. While my relatives had been questioning my career choices and professional judgment, Beacon Press employees were treating me as an author whose creative vision and market instincts deserved respect and support. Their confidence in my work and their willingness to invest substantial resources in its publication provided external validation that contradicted years of family concerns about the viability of creative careers. This professional recognition also created new pressure to justify the publisher's confidence through successful collaboration and effective participation in promotional activities. The responsibility of representing not only my own work but also Beacon Press's investment in my career was more significant than the personal responsibility I had felt during the years of private writing development. The stakes were higher, the timeline was compressed, and the outcomes would be visible to industry professionals and general readers whose evaluations would affect my long-term career prospects. The week of preparation for my New York visit required intensive research into publishing industry protocols, professional communication standards, and the specific roles of different team members with whom I would be working. I studied Beacon Press's recent publications to understand their editorial preferences, marketing approaches, and the types of authors who had achieved success through their promotional programs. I also researched contemporary trends in Latino literature, debut novel marketing, and literary fiction promotion to prepare for discussions about positioning The Weight of Silence within current market conditions and reader expectations. The travel to New York represented my first professional trip as a contracted author, and the experience of being welcomed as a valued business partner rather than as an aspiring writer seeking acceptance was profoundly different from any professional interaction I had experienced during my previous career. The publishing house office environment reflected serious commitment to literary culture and author development, with extensive libraries, comfortable meeting spaces designed for creative collaboration, and staff members whose expertise and enthusiasm demonstrated genuine appreciation for books and authors. My meetings with the editorial team revealed the sophisticated analytical approach that professional publishers applied to manuscript development and market positioning. Margaret Thornton and her colleagues had identified specific strengths in The Weight of Silence that aligned with current reader interests and critical trends, but they had also recognized opportunities for refinement that would enhance the novel's commercial appeal and literary impact. The editorial suggestions they provided were more nuanced and strategically informed than any feedback I had received during the manuscript's development. Their recommendations addressed not only technical aspects of character development and narrative structure, but also market considerations related to how different reader demographics would respond to specific themes and how literary critics would evaluate the novel's contribution to contemporary Latino literature. The marketing team's presentation about promotional strategy was equally sophisticated, demonstrating detailed knowledge about media outlets, literary events, and reader communities that would be most receptive to The Weight of Silence. Their plan included targeted outreach to book clubs, library systems, and educational institutions that specifically sought Latino authors and culturally focused literature. They had also identified potential speaking opportunities at universities, cultural centers, and literary festivals, where I could connect with readers who were particularly interested in the themes my novel explored.